Thank you all very much. I'm very humbled to be in this position to thank you for your participation. Unfortunately, I've been in Silver City for many days, which is in the southwest quadrant of the state, sort of looking at the cultural landscapes of that part of New Mexico. And so I've thought about you a great deal as I was in that very, very picturesque cultural landscape, a cultural landscape of mining towns. But I do want to thank you all. I understand that it has been a wonderful conversation, and I know that it has taken extraordinary coordination, both, an international collaboration between all of you who came from the Versailles School and here at UNM. I know that Chris has been working on this nonstop, and that indicates to me that you all have as well. So those of you that are the beneficiaries of this intense collaboration, thank you as well for joining us today. And I hope that, as Chris has indicated, we will have this wonderful exhibit and reception to adjourn to after this final session. So thank you very much. And congratulations to the two organizers and collaborators.
Frédéric and I agreed about everything throughout the development of this. What a pleasure to work with you, and I'll let you go.
Thank you, Chris. Yes. First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers for their excellent expose and the participants for their stimulating contribution to the debate. The debate we have had was very rich, and it's not an easy task to establish conclusive elements. There were numerous issues at stake, from the photography of cultural landscapes, inhabited or natural landscapes, to the role played by photography in the transformations of landscapes, either through activism or landscape projects realized by architectural landscape offices. All the issues debated during the conference can be related to G.B. Jackson's thought, which appears to be an extraordinary theoretical ground, enabling the articulation of one to another. Indeed, each speaker has made his own reference to G.B. Jackson's thought, and this conference highlights how inspiring G.B. Jackson's work is. Furthermore, this conference enables us to deepen our understanding of Jackson's work, thanks to the study of the photographs he shot all during the time he taught at Berkeley, Harvard, and Rice University. Until recently, the collection of his slides has remained uninvestigated. Now it has become possible. Paul Groth's presentation has shed light on his teaching practice from inside, analyzing the strategies of ranking and selecting the slides that he used to develop his lectures and his writings. Helen Horowitz's presentation made a meaningful contribution to the knowledge of Jackson's personality when she interrogated the eye behind the camera and the drawings. Jordi Ballesta investigated Jackson's cross-country trips, and both pieces it together and mapped the routes Jackson traveled between Harvard and Berkeley and back to Santa Fe. In order to communicate his thoughts, Jackson developed editorial strategies which Bruno Lotbohm has described in detail and contextualized in the larger debate about landscape covered in architectural and planning journals. These diverse contributions open new perspectives, not only for deepening our understanding of Jackson's work, but also for interrogating the media devoted to the debate about landscape. Conference, journals, books, Center for Land Use Interpretation, etc., and the connections at stake between them. It seems to me that this is the key issue brought to light by the close analysis of Jackson's work during the past 2 days. This could also constitute a first of the issues for conclusive debate. Moreover, several exposés proposed a large framework to address key issues such as the vernacular representation, as Tim Davis has done. Lucy Lippard has addressed the critical value of photography and the critical function of artistic processes in the face of political, ecological, and social challenges. Laurie Collins' talk shed light on the professional context of landscape architects in the second half of the 20th century and on the role played by photography. The examples provided throughout these presentations describe the framework for artistic and professional productions closely connected to social and historical context. The close reading of Landscape Project by Marie-Madeleine Ozdeba, the detailed analysis of photographic commission by Raphaël Berthaud, and my own analysis of photographic observatories, together reveal specific uses of photographs. Such uses influence the practices of artists and photographers on the one hand, of those who commission photographs and the landscape projects on the other. To connect such original uses to the photographic trends in the field of landscape photography and the evolution of practice in the field of landscape architecture is today a challenge. The intersection of presentations which offer a large framework with those more focused case studies enables us to discuss the value of such original photographic practices as related to a professional context. But photography is not only oriented to project communication, it plays many other roles. The second issue for our conclusive debate might be vernacular photography, considering the double meaning of the term vernacular. Indeed, vernacular photography designates photographs produced in a non-artistic process on one hand, and on the other, a category of photographs whose object is the vernacular landscape. Finally, it seems to me that our conference has highlighted the subjective nature of photography through its aesthetic dimension. And this is the third issue that I would like to suggest for the debate. I will elaborate a little bit on that issue. According to Monique Sicard, the aesthetic of the photographic image constitutes a vector for emotions. For Lucy Lippard, those who choose beauty make choices and argue strategies. For Tim Davis, the subjective nature of photography enhances its value both as a discursive practice and as a resource for cultural landscape research. Sabine Delcour's work shows the commitment of the photographer to her practice as well as to the photographed object. For her, the practice of landscape photography means to be inhabited by the landscape that she explores. In the same vein, in his work, Michael Gundert exhibits a strong commitment to social issues. This raises the question in specific connection with landscape of how to bring together a subjective photography and a more analytical documentary photography. The historical perspective elicited by the exhibition on old and new topographic photography, as well as Lynn Chip's talk, which commented on the various historical context entailed by the birth of new topographics, supply keys to better understanding of what is going on today. The Center for Land Use Interpretation proposes a documentary use of photographic images for visualizing the identity of the American landscape. It involves all kinds of photographic images, aerial views, images collected from the web, Google Earth shots, and artistic photographs. The objective is to shift from such abstract representations of the territory as maps and to the visualization of the anthropological landscape. Among other projects, the American Land Museum proposes a collection of places. What kind of subjectivities could be linked to such places? In conclusion, I would like to come back to Jackson's work and to say how alive it is and how relevant his thought is in French landscape studies today. I sincerely hope that this conference will encourage dialogue and collaboration in the future.
I'd also like to thank all of the speakers and chairs for the excellent quality of the presentations and the discussion. Really wonderful additions from the audience as well. I was very happy to see Monique Sicard's demonstration of her photographic genetic approach, the idea of conventional archaeology, of unearthing the process and the factors involved in the production of photography and of art. And I think her demonstration in the use of the proof sheets, the text by the artist, the interviews, really showed the genesis of the very evocative work of Clouseau. And I think I discerned that spirit of photographic genetic, or I thought of it as an archaeology of unearthing things overlooked in many of the younger French scholars. J.B. Jackson, I think, very much did not want anyone to write a biography of him. And he destroyed most of what an author of his stature and long career normally would have left to a library. I mean, Helen knows exactly, but it was a couple of boxes of material only that really came out of his office. And we have Helen and Paul Groth and Audra Belmore to thank for assembling a good deal of material to augment what Jackson didn't want us to have. One of the most important parts of that, of course, is putting together 5,500 of his slides. And to begin to have these younger French scholars, and I'm thinking of Jordy's work on slides, Bruno's analysis of the visual narrative, the visual rhetoric of Landscape magazine, are bringing a fresh analysis to the kind of personal connection and deep thought that Helen Horowitz and Paul Groth themselves have made and have presented in the book that we've just published. Leading to, I knew the guy, I've thought a lot about him. I've learned a lot, and there are new questions that have come out of these discussions. Leading, for instance, Richard Longstreth to propose that Jackson didn't compose his photographs. He was concerned with inclusion, what he was going to include. Now, there was immediate pushback on that, and I understand that. What I would suggest is that inclusion of the proper components was his first consideration, and then we can analyze his work, and there are Renaissance perspectival aspects. His use of the road, as a disappearing line in the perspective. There are, elements in which we naturally read balanced, asymmetric, romantic composition. There are even elements of a modernist flattening of the plane and abstraction when he moves in close to detail. But I think it's right to say, or at least I agree with Richard's idea, what was important to him often was to get the essential components of a landscape ensemble together so that we could see them, or sometimes to get a subtle pattern and something that didn't fit to pose the question, what's going on here? It's a little bit like Miguel Gandert's photographs, and I see him coming into public celebrations, and he kind of sees, and he says, oh, there's this, and there's this, and there's this. Some of it's symbolic, some of it formal, and he moves around, and in the spirit of Cartier-Bresson, he gets the critical moment where he gives all the proper components for an image. And I think Jackson's assembly of landscape elements, is the important thing. There's also a second type of his photograph, which is the use of humor or self-reference. And the signage does it, the mirrors do it, so there are ones that are more asking questions than resolving a landscape ensemble. But I really enjoyed the way in which the discussion triggered questions like that, and allowed us to ask new questions. Now, the other thing that I really found coming out somewhat yesterday, but especially today, was the challenge of using photography to capture space. In an operational way in landscape architecture, or just the fact that landscapes or public spaces are so big. How do you actually capture them in a photograph? I think Miguel's use of the panoramic camera and learning how to photograph the social frame with a panoramic camera, so he also got the larger environment, is instructive. But then the many examples in Laurie and Marie Madeleine's work of the use of panorama, image collage, atlases of assembled photographs, and not just space, but time, that is to say, change. So the rephotographic project as a way of trying to get at that complexity. It may be invidious to say this, but I felt that the American scholars had more of a retrospective gaze, and some of the French scholars and some of the work that they were talking about had more of a prospective gaze. Now, I'll say, I think that's in part a function of the fact that from the American side, we're celebrating the publication of a book which is retrospective, and I think all of us in the book knew Jackson, and so in a sense, we've used the book as an opportunity to share what we can of the picture of Jackson, of our thoughts, but also of our experiences with him. And then also the fact that I asked Tim and Laurie in particular to make surveys of, in Tim's case, the history of landscape photography, in Laurie's the history of especially 35 millimeter photography. But again, the things that they brought to the fore raised new questions. I mean, Paul's saying, well, Jackson never mentions Walker Evans. Jackson had a full run of the first 5 or 10 years of Fortune magazine. So he knew Walker Evans, not just his photography, but what he had to say and his interest in postcards. Or Laurie's, clear demonstration of a kind of Bauhaus modernist graphic approach, and the ways in which it abstracted texture, material, and detail. And he didn't have time to develop all of these things, but the very clear implication was the way in which photography and graphics and magazine fed actually into the design process and into the aesthetics. Yeah, and there's very, very much there in a wonderful way. And then I think we had a series of talks, mostly today, but starting with Frédéric's yesterday, which raised the question of photographic surveys or missions. We had the exhibit and Lynn's comments on the new topographic exhibit of 1957. Raphael's comparison of the New Mexico photographic survey of the early 1980s and Datar of the late 1980s, and then Frédéric's treatment of the photographic missions of the last 20 years or so in France, and then finally Matt's description of his own Center for Land Use Interpretation. So we have a kind of, genealogy is not the right word, a sequence of related approaches, related projects. And when I say that some of the work presented has a decidedly prospective quality, I think the recent French observatories or photographic missions in being formed with advisory boards that include local officials, being part of the result of the land the land planning legislation, national land planning legislation of 1993. There's the idea that photography, and especially artistic interpretive photography, rephotography, and the enlistment of citizen participation in the project can be a valuable part of the evolving consciousness and identity of a region, the grounding of planning in those issues. That's how I projected into. What? What? Oh, okay, good. Now, for me, there was a telling question at the very end of the day yesterday. And that was the question, Frédéric was here, Matt was here. What about funding? Where did the funding come from? And just let us notice that these were, the New Mexico Photographic Survey, DATAR, the Photographic Missions and Observatory, or the Photographic Observatory, had government funding. And then it came to Matt, and he listed his funding, mainly foundations. So there's, and I think it was Raphael said, these have to be viewed in their cultural, economic, and political context, each of these initiatives. And so one of the changes, of course, is the Reagan Revolution of politics in the U.S., which is bound up with globalization, one of the manifestations of which I take to be a shift of resources and power from government to corporations. There's been a concomitant corporate, assertive corporate control over media and a depolitization of public broadcasting and public media in the United States. At the same time that there once was funding for, especially around the bicentennial and into the 1980s, for these kind of projects, and there's been a real atrophy of funding for humanities and arts in the United States, and a shift of resources towards instrumental scientific engineering and so forth. Which leaves not just math, but artists and photographers who are doing things on a wing and a prayer. Now they weren't lavishly funded ever by the government, but there was much more support to undertake something like the New Mexico Photographic Survey. But I find it heartening, that in Jackson's own work, there was a shift from thinking of landscape mainly as an object out there to the code, to late in his career being really concerned about, well, what's the use in the landscape? How are the people that really live there make it work? How does their subterranean economy interact with the landscape? And in a way, as Lucy said, from landscape to land use in the focus. And there's an implicit politics in making that shift from the romantic, picturesque landscape to the land that's engaged with culture and economy and politics. And heartening to see the artists that have shifted maybe from, in some cases, personal expression to a political activism. But as we saw, just very convincingly, very movingly in our first session today, Miguel and Sabine, both great artists, both just viscerally and intellectually connected to their work and connected to grasping and conveying a landscape. We saw the power of landscape photography in that way. Thank you. We were going to open this up for questions and discussion. A couple of observations, not questions to us, I think, but any other observations, summary comments that people have formulated for themselves?